Hi there. I'm going to read to us today a story called Mr. Noisy by Roger Hardgraves. Now, this book I'm going to read you, it's one of my favourites. It's one that my mum and dad used to read to me when I was a little girl. So I thought I would share this book with you today. You can see it's quite old. And we're going to be looking at Mr. Noisy. What do you think Mr. Noisy might be about? Sounds like he might be a noisy person, doesn't it? Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he would be shouting at the top of his voice. And at the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. 100 miles away, that'd be a long way. He must be very loud. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But achoo! But when Mr. Snoisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. He's very loud. Now this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed in his bedroom, in his house, which is at the top of a hill. He was snoring. And as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Does anyone know anyone who snores? Does Daddy snore? Does Mummy snore? Do you think they're as loud as Mr. Noisy? No, probably not. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up, and so did all the other people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of the town where Mr. Noisy's hill. My goodness, must be a loud alarm. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! And the door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled, Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high in the sky wobbled. My goodness. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He walked into the baker's shop. Crashed the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a loaf of bread, boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. My goodness, he's very loud. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher's. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door as he opened it. Bang went the door as he shut it. I'd like a piece of meat, boomed Mr. Noisy. Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and he sold him some meat. My goodness, everybody's finding him very noisy. Do you feel like when people are a bit noisy, they're a bit scary? I do. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy, she said. Absolutely, replied Mr. Bacon. But what? I know, said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered in Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. Mrs. Crumb, he said, I think you have the answer. What do you think they're up to? What do you think their plan is? I wonder. The following day, Mr. Noisy went shopping down to Wobbletown. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He went into Mr. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. Sorry, what did you say? Asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. I'd like a loaf of bread, Mr. Noisy shouted. Sorry, said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Can you speak up, please? I like a loaf of bread, roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out. He didn't get his loaf of bread, did he? Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up, went out, went home, went to bed, hungry. Oh, he looks a bit sad. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the very top of his voice. A loaf of... And then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said. So Mrs. Crumb's happy, and Mr. Noisy has learnt something, hasn't he? Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon said, my pleasure. There's Mr. Bacon. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off up the hill. Clomp, clomp, clomp. He's still a bit noisy, isn't he? Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Look at him, tiptoeing. Little worms watching him. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put on his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside and then shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy never tried either. That was fun too. Look at him, he's happy in his chair. And he's learnt some lessons, hasn't he? And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learnt to whisper. Well, there we go. So what do we think that was about? It was about sometimes people are very noisy. And Mr. Noisy, he was a very noisy person. He scared people with how noisy he was. And we learned how when we're quiet, people sometimes listen more because find it a lot easier when people are a bit quieter. All right, I hope you enjoyed this book, and we'll read again another time.